I have seen the torch of freedom pass from hand to yearning hand, and the vision of our fathers spread hope throughout this land, as the dream some fought and died for in my heart becomes my own. I will strive to keep her promise, America, my home. America, America, may God bless America, and freedom reign across America, my home. From the shorelines to the prairies, to the cities great and small, we have reaped the fruits of justice and liberty for all. So with deep appreciation for the blessings of freedom that we know in this wonderful land of Oz, I'm Dr. George Simon, welcoming you to another edition of Character Matters. This is the program where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that we face and that affects so many aspects of our daily life. So many areas of our life are affected by this character issue, from our individual relationships to our family relationships, our community relationships, our politics, our business affairs. Everything is affected by the character issue. Character really does matter. Unfortunately, for many years, we've kind of sloughed it off as unimportant. And we've allowed a slippery slope to develop whereby a vicious cycle, a very detrimental vicious cycle has developed, where because we've had so much more character disturbance, as I write about in my books, we had so much character disturbance develop that our social institutions that foster character development began to erode. Too many people were entering the society without the character necessary to build a solid foundation. And of course, as our character fostering institutions eroded, then there wasn't the structure to help forge character in our young people. A very negative, vicious cycle, which is why in my book, Character Disturbance, I introduced for the first time the 10 Commandments of Character Development that I am completing a book about that should be out very soon. It will be the 5th major publication of mine, in addition to my 4 existing bestsellers. And it probably will be my last work, but it will be my final contribution to not only the field of psychology and relationships, but also my final contribution to the general public for helping deal with this enormous problem that we face. You know, it takes more and more to unnerve and outrage us with regard to character disturbances. Folks behaving badly and revealing themselves to be a poor character. It used to take not very much to revolt us. We expected certain standards of behavior, especially among our leaders. And as we got steadily used to worse and worse and worse, it takes so much too outrageous that we're now in a state of affairs where even the most egregious example of character disturbance has become almost bearable for us. And this is especially true of narcissism of any kind. We've talked about that at many times on the program. But tonight I want to talk about something really different. And I invite you in the listening audience to chime in with comments at our call-in number at 501-258-8326. That's 501-258-8326. We're going to talk tonight about something I haven't talked very much about at all, and that is sexual addiction. I didn't write about it in this last blog post on my blog site at manipulative-people.com or drgeorgesimon.com. Either URL will take you to the same place. Didn't write about it this last Friday. That was not the post. But do want to talk about it for a number of reasons. First and foremost is the fact that this problem is diagnosed far more frequently than it actually occurs. In other words, just because you're behaving badly sexually does not mean that you have a sexual addiction. And just because you're behaving badly sexually repeatedly over the course of time, serial philandering, is not necessarily an indication of sexual addiction. Genuine sexual addiction has certain characteristics to it. We're going to be talking about that. And the reason this is important is because a lot of folks have experienced what we call in the psychology business, they've experienced what we call therapy-induced trauma, which means that the very interventions that the person hoped would help make their lives better actually traumatized them in many ways. We'll talk a little bit about this. I know so many people whose relationship partners were diagnosed as having sexual addictions. They went into these fancy treatment programs that cost a pretty penny, sometimes in posh locations, spent many dollars trying to get some help, only to find that the problem didn't get any better. And on top of that, having invested an awful lot, spent an awful lot, so all the relationship partner had to show for the effort was a drained bank account and a still philandering partner. That's therapy-induced trauma. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about when genuine addiction occurs and what it takes to get on top of the problem. Now, I know that there are folks out there who have experienced this problem. So we'd like to hear from you. And, of course, the number to call is 501-258-8326. That's 501-258-8326. I've been giving out two phone numbers for a couple of weeks. I've been informed that for various technical reasons, the first phone number that I'd been giving out is still not working right. So that's why I'm giving out only the one number this week. We are live. This is Sunday, September the 10th, 2017. And you know, we have an anniversary coming up of September 11th on Monday. And I thought about playing for you in its entirety the theme song that we play at the beginning and the end of the program, because a lot of folks really enjoy hearing that. Some folks even record it. And the song became popular after the tragedy of 9/11, 2001. But the song is not a 9/11 song. It was written 2 years earlier. It was actually written in phases even earlier than that, but it was copyrighted 2 years earlier. And it was designed as an anthem for the new millennium, a patriotic piece that was designed to speak to the heart and to testify um, to the heart of America's real greatness during times of greatness, namely the character of its people. When people of real integrity are left alone by their government, they tend to prosper and they tend to create opportunities for others and they tend to help one another. But when people behave badly, and when too many people behave badly, there's the constant invitation of government to try and legislate morality, basically, only in the process restricting the freedoms of decent people. Because, quite frankly, those of us of poor character who are of a mind to do bad things don't really care what kind of rules we write and what kind of laws we pass, what kinds of policies we adopt. They don't particularly pay attention to this kind of stuff. They're always finding ways around it. That's just the nature of character disturbance. So we really waste an awful lot of time and energy trying to control bad behavior that way. And that's really what the song was meant to speak to. It's an inspirational piece testifying to the responsibility of each and every person to uphold the ideals that we preach, that we hold. So I thought about playing that for you because this anniversary date is coming up. But I decided against it because we really need to get into some serious discussion here about a really serious problem that we've got in the character arena. And that has to do with people's sexual irresponsibility and how it impacts intimate relationships. You know, I wrote this article on Friday, and it posted late in the afternoon as usual on my blog at manipulative-people.com or drgeorgesimon.com. Either URL will take you to the same place, as I mentioned before. I wrote this article on just exactly what constitutes a character disorder and how our definitions have changed or are in the process of changing. For a long time, the powers that be that officially classify mental disorders have thought about disorders of personality and character being patterns of behavior, patterns of relating, patterns of perceiving the world and dealing with the world, patterns of perceiving others and dealing with others, preferred patterns like this. We've tended to look at a disorder as a way of relating that was so extreme in its manifestation, so inflexible, so immutable, so unchangeable, so unbendable and unmodifiable, or so deviant from the norm that it caused distress in the person, distress to other people, and also interfered with the person's ability cope with life and to prosper in various life endeavors. And this whole definition has come under question lately because a lot of these personality styles, let's take narcissism, for example, the narcissistic style. A lot of these styles actually work for people. They pay off in many respects. There are certain occupational cultures, certain work cultures, corporate cultures. There's certain enterprises that actually prize this kind of behavior, even reward it. And that's why we have so much of it. But the real dilemma comes in relationships. The real dilemma comes in how intimacy is either fostered or impaired in a relationship. And the crisis that we face today is best exemplified at the relationship level. If relationships weren't at an all-time low as a result of the character crisis, we wouldn't have so many relationships falling apart. You know, you're far more likely to enter a marriage that ends in divorce than remain in a marriage that endures for years. And you're far more likely, this is an interesting statistic, but you're far more likely, if you've already had one failed marriage, you're far more likely to have another. That's right. Your chances don't improve. The reason for that is, well, there are two reasons. Well, both reasons are related. The statistics seem to indicate that folks don't really profit very much by the experience of a relationship failure. And the reason they don't seem to profit very much is because character and character issues are at the root of the problem in the first place. And when those issues aren't successfully addressed and when they're not changed, the chances of another relationship failure remain. It always comes down to character. It always comes down to character. And the ability to adequately judge character. You know, I talk to professionals all the time at my training workshops about this. You know, I'm veering a little off course here, but just indulge me for a minute. One of the things I emphasize in my training workshops with professionals is the axiom that they teach medical professionals, all medical professionals, not just people going into psychiatry, but all medical professionals are taught this very early on in their training, in their first year of training, generally in medical school. They're taught the axiom that intervention in the absence of and not in accordance with proper and sound diagnosis, intervention in the absence of and not in accordance with proper, sound diagnosis is the very definition of malpractice. That axiom means that getting right what you are dealing with should dictate to you what you need to do to intervene to have the best chances of a successful outcome. There are certain standards in medical practice. There are certain standards. certain accepted kinds of interventions given the nature of the diagnosis. And if you're out of step and you're out of line there, if you do something that's not by the book, so to speak, given the diagnosis, then you're likely to get sued for malpractice because there are certain accepted procedures for dealing with certain things. Well, it should be no different in the mental health services area. Unfortunately, all too many times these days, helping professionals will just start talking and working with people with absolutely no idea who they're dealing with in character and what the diagnosis really is. You see, unfortunately, we have a way of classifying our psychiatric disturbances that is based strictly on behavior. This was to eliminate any ambiguity and inconsistency and lack of objectivity. We wanted to remove the subjectivity of diagnosis. So we made it strictly based on various behaviors. And unfortunately, what's at the root of the problem is often just completely ignored. And most of the time, these days, in our day and time, in our character-impaired time, in our days of permissiveness, moral relativism, and especially entitlement, in our day and time, the culprit is usually character. And so when an intervening professional doesn't understand who they're dealing with in character, then they're not going to tailor their approach appropriately when trying to intervene. And this couldn't be any more crucial than in the area of sexual addiction or sexual misbehavior. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, because there is a big difference between patterns of irresponsible sexual behavior that so many disturbed characters exhibit and true sexual addiction. Now, let me talk about this just a little bit. You can be a disturbed character, a person with impaired conscience, inadequate character development, inadequate integrity, who has intimacy problems in relationships and tends to be exploitative and sexually perhaps predatory and even exploitative, and have a sexual addiction too. So you can have a genuine sex addiction and be a pretty impaired character. You can also have a sexual addiction and be an otherwise fairly decent person. And then you can be an impaired character with sexual behavior problems and not be suffering a sexual addiction at all. So I want to talk about the differences here tonight. And I also want those of you who have had experience, especially those of you who have had experience trying to get help in experiencing what we call therapy-induced trauma by spending a lot of money and not getting any results and maybe only feeling more used and abused in the process. I'd like you to comment for us and help inform the listening audience. And the number to call is area code 501-258-8326. That's 501-258-8326. And I'll be happy to take your call. So let's talk a little bit about sexual misbehavior and genuine sexual addiction. You know, there are individuals of impaired character because they haven't developed sufficient empathy, care, concern about others, and because they have a pretty impaired conscience. They know right from wrong, but they don't really care enough to at least try really to do right as opposed to wrong. And they're relatively incapable of genuine intimacy in their relationships. They tend to be shallow in those relationships and to basically use and abuse relationship partners. They tend to be in relationships for what they can get out of the relationship. Maybe they're simply attracted to someone's physical attributes. They find someone beautiful or handsome or attractive in some way, and they want to be with them simply because they want the pleasure involved in having sexual contact with this person who turns them on. But if that's as far as it goes, if there's no genuine concern for the person and their welfare, this is not going to go very far. This is not going to go very far. Sooner or later, a person so inclined, who's only interested in the superficial, is going to become tired and bored with the mundane and is going to start looking elsewhere. That's just the way it goes. I see this pattern so many times. What I see on the front end of a relationship is there's no real vetting going on other than what the person saw that attracted them. Couples rarely get to know one another in character very well at the outset of a relationship. You know, we used to have so many structures that were so commonplace, so many institutions that were designed to facilitate this process of really getting to know your potential future lifetime partner. Back when people really seriously considered marriage a lifetime commitment. Families were involved. Everyone was involved. There was vetting that went on. During engagement periods, the whole point of the engagement was not to just latch on to one another right away, but to really get to know one another intimately, to know one another's character, and to know whether or not this was the kind, not was whether this was the person, because that's all much more emotionally driven, but whether this was the kind of person that you could live with day in and day out, and that you admired enough and felt strongly enough about their capacity to not only be a good partner in life, but to be a good parent, etc., etc. And you didn't just trust your own judgment. During these engagement periods, the extended family and friends, close associates, we're all part of the feedback system. What do you think of this guy? What do you think of this woman? Is this a good match? Is this a good fit? All that was taken into consideration, and it was taken seriously. Oh, have times changed? And is it any wonder why relationships don't hold up? You know, we've done this to ourselves. And, we're paying the price. Failed relationships come with a cost, a really big cost. People invest in relationships. They invest time. They invest money. They invest in a lot of emotional energy. And when a relationship starts to fall apart, or when there's a major trust betrayal, it's emotionally traumatizing and devastating. It affects people, it causes a lot of pain. And when there are children involved, the effects are amplified. It's gotten to be one of the most serious problems that we face. Without solid individual relationships, there can't be solid community relations. I was unfortunately unable to attend a gathering that I wanted to go to of concerned civic leaders in my local community. I had to be 3 different places at once, and I had to pick the one place that I felt most strongly about being at. So I went to this interfaith gathering. But there was a gathering of interested community leaders, invested community leaders, trying to do something to stem the violence plaguing our inner city. As so many inner cities face the same problems. We have an incredible homicide rate in this country. It's absolutely incredible. And a lot of folks want to blame the instruments by which these crimes are committed. But I have to tell you, people will use anything. It's the value of human life being so low, and the lack of impulse control, and the lack of empathy, and the lack of general internal control that is responsible for all this violent crime. And how does that occur? I mean, how do we end up there? Well, that's what these community leaders were discussing, and they were discussing what it would take to fix it. And because I couldn't be there, I made myself, I availed myself of the proceedings of this meeting. And I was just astounded by what I heard. Absolutely astounded. And it was really heartening to hear folks who are on the front lines of the fight to stem all the violence plaguing our inner cities. I was just stunned and shocked and happily so to hear some folks say some things. One individual got up and with eloquence pointed out that the very last thing that anybody needed who was really interested in stemming this outrageous, this frightening, this deplorable situation of the amount of violence that goes on in our communities, especially in our inner cities. The one thing this gentleman said that we do not need is another meeting to decide what to do or to discuss the problem. What's really needed is some action, and not preaching to the choir, but action at the grassroots level by the individuals involved. It's the families that can make a difference. No substitute, this individual warned, for parenting. No substitute. You build strong character. You build a strong conscience. You build integrity. You foster that development in an individual. Then you don't have to worry. And you do that by providing a good example, by establishing and enforcing appropriate limits and boundaries, by helping an individual internalize a set of values and principles. That's how you do it. You raise people of integrity. You can't raise people of integrity in a dysfunctional, permissive, morally relativistic environment. It's not how you do it. You raise individuals of integrity in an environment where there's genuine love and concern, adequate nurturing, there's ample cultivation of empathy, assistance, guidance in forming a sound conscience. We raise people of integrity. We fill our communities with people of integrity. We don't have to worry that they're going to kill each other. It's that simple. But that takes intact relationships, mutually respecting relationships. It takes stability in the family environment. It takes the daily presence of concerned parents who model appropriate values and live them out by example. That's what it takes. We are the only creatures on the planet that take as long as we do to socialize. And I've written about this many times. Matter of fact, one of the articles that you really need to read, whether it be on my manipulative-people.com blog or the counselingresource.com blog, is socialization is a process. It's a process that starts very early and it goes on for a long period of time. As I mentioned just moments ago, we are the only creatures on the planet that take so long to socialize. No one is born civilized. And we've had this misguided notion for so long that people would turn out just fine if they didn't experience some negative circumstances in their developmental years, or if they didn't experience trauma. And while trauma can indeed arrest or stunt someone's character development and growth, the more insidious reality these days is that people aren't getting what they need in the way of careful guidance. It's not so much the trauma that arrests their character development, many times, although that can be a factor. It's what they're not getting in the way of positive character guidance. That's what's making all the difference. Many folks are just trying to figure it out in their 50s and 60s, trying to figure out where they went so wrong, how they got it so wrong, why so many relationships failed, why so much of their life was all screwed up. And then they're coming to the realization, way past midlife, how it all went so wrong. Socialization is a process. Every hour, every day, day after day, week after week, month after month, for years, many, many, many years, before we're prepared to function adaptively in a social environment. We're the only creatures on the planet for which that is true. And what's happened to us is that there are so many individuals completely unprepared to do exactly that, to function adaptively in the social world. And that starts in the environment in which they were raised. We have to be raised, and we have to be raised in certain ways. It can't just be relative. There are certain rules that apply. There are certain things that foster character development arrest, and there are certain things that foster positive character growth. Virtue has to be taught. It has to be instilled. And then it has to be reinforced in order to stick. People have to be tested. That's the way it works. It's the rules of the game. And it couldn't be more important when it comes to sexual behavior. It couldn't be more important. You know, Sigmund Freud, he had one thing really, really right. He said, you want to look at human misery, it all comes down to two things. What really matters is we have these primal drives in us all, and how we manage those primal drives really makes all the difference. So when you really look at human misery, it always comes down to two things: sex and aggression. Think about it. Sex and aggression. These two great drives in us. We are inherently aggressive creatures. We are. It is a fight to survive and to prosper. Make no mistake, this is a cold, cruel, potentially hostile world. Nothing is guaranteed. We have to fight for everything. It's been that way since the dawn of time. To prosper, you have to do a fair amount of fighting. To survive, you have to do a fair amount of fighting. And if you do that fighting with principle, with discipline, with proper respect for others' rights and needs, proper respect for appropriate boundaries and limits, we call that assertion. We call that assertive behavior. And it's the healthiest behavior that we know of. The other great drive, of course, is the sexual drive. It's a strong one. It's a strong one. It's a strong one for a reason. Sure as our survival. But in the age of character impairment, in the age of character disturbance, irresponsible sexual behavior is just as commonplace as irresponsible aggressive behavior. And really, that's kind of an oxymoron, because responsible aggressive behavior is what we call assertive behavior. So, once again, Freud had it right. Sex and aggression are the big culprits when it comes to problems in society. And sexual irresponsibility today is equal, I would say, in importance to all the irresponsible fighting that we do that creates so much trouble, all the aggressive behavior that is responsible for so much trouble, and not just in relationships, in business, in our community relations, in our politics. Boy, this last election cycle, the kinds of dirty fighting, and it still goes on, because what we have now in our politics is a constant election cycle. The campaign never stops. Somebody gets in office, and from the very day they're elected, before they even get in there, the other side is doing battle to undo things. It never stops. We've become completely irresponsible in the way we fight, how often we fight, and in the manner in which we fight. Just look at the ways people were going at each other during the last election cycle. No respect. Oh, you can't say that character doesn't matter. Things will get better when we decide that we're going to make character cool again, when we decide that we're going to make character matter again. Everything's going to get better, I promise. I've been at this business of helping people change their lives for many years now. And I'd like to think that I've been taught a few lessons along the way. And I can tell you that things get better for people, not just for themselves, but for their relationship partners and for their families. Things get better when people decide that character does indeed matter after all. And when they get to working on their character. Now, when it comes to irresponsible sexual behavior, outside of sexual addiction, outside of genuine sexual addiction, which we'll talk about in just a minute, you got to have true empathy. A true ability to care at a relatively deep level for the welfare of somebody else. You got to be able to feel what they feel. And if you want to hold a relationship together, there's got to be enough mutual regard that you really want You want to keep a commitment. Unfortunately, today, people are in relationships for what they can get out of it. And then those relationships tend to be shallow, exploitative. I hooked up with you because I thought you were great looking. I got what I needed, satisfied. I'm kind of bored with you now. And besides which, you don't look like you used to. And besides which, it takes an awful lot of work to get along with you. I think I'm out of here. And whether a person physically leaves or leaves in other ways, at least emotionally, and pursues other opportunities, determines whether or not the relationship is going to hold up. And all too often these days, the relationship doesn't hold up. And if there are children involved, it's tragic. Because make no mistake, they're watching and they're learning. They're observing. They can't help but notice. We're always sending messages, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. We're always sending messages. And our behavior speaks volume. Our behavior says it all about the beliefs that we hold dearest, the beliefs that we truly hold dearest, and the attitudes that we have. Our behavior speaks much louder than our words. We can talk all day long about the beliefs we hold, but our behavior really gives us away. That was the point I tried to make in the Judas syndrome, that our behavior really betrays our genuine belief system and our genuine faith. We betray ourselves in our lack of faith and our lack of solidly internalized moral compass with our behavior. So there's a lot of sexual irresponsibility in relationships these days for all the reasons I mentioned, not the least of which is the massive sense of entitlement that's out there. But then there are such things as genuine sexual addictions, and people don't get there overnight. I find it very, very rare. Matter of fact, I think it's pretty much impossible, but I'm not willing to exclude the possibility that a person of otherwise decent character can become sexually addicted. Most examples that I see of so-called sexual addiction are not sexual addictions at all, but rather just patterns of repeated sexual irresponsibility arising out of character disturbance, arising out of an underdeveloped character, a poorly developed sense of conscience, an impaired capacity to really care about others, to relate to them in a respectful way as opposed to an exploitative manner. But sexual addictions do exist. And when they do, what has happened is that a person has derived far too much pleasure in the first place from the mere physical realities of sexual behavior, mere physical pleasures of sex, and place such a premium on it, become so invested in it. There's no question that sexual behavior is pleasurable. For most people, it's quite pleasurable. And the way we are wired to pursue pleasure. And in our days of rampant hedonism, where it's so easy to adopt a hedonistic pattern of thinking, an attitude of pleasure pursuit, where we're always looking after and chasing after, always looking for and chasing after the next high in life, because we haven't cultivated any will to bear any discomfort. We're always looking for what will make us feel good, basically. This is hedonistic thinking. I talk about it in my book, Character Disturbance. And I talk about it in the Judas Syndrome as well, and I talk about it in How Did We End Up Here, too. When we develop these patterns, we tend to be shallow in our relationships. Just looking for what excites us and not going any deeper than that. And sooner or later, the inevitable happens. Things get old. Things get boring. Things get mundane. And we're not turned on as much anymore. And so what does the hedonistically inclined individual do? Well, it takes a lot of work, effort, without a short-term payoff. It takes a lot of work and effort to cultivate a relationship of depth. But the hedonistically inclined person who's kind of gotten bored and is not deriving the same satisfaction that they used to derive out of their relationship starts looking someplace else. And if they seek, they usually find. And once they find, they're hooked on something else. And then that gets old and mundane and boring. And then they have to seek something else. They build a certain tolerance, just like any addiction. And they go through some withdrawal because they have nothing else bringing them any joy in life except these temporary hedonistic episodes. And that's how they get hooked. And that's also how they fail to develop even the capacity for depth in a relationship. It's all shallow, superficial, exploitative. And the pattern repeats. I can't tell you how many individuals, how many couples I've seen in my career who are just absolutely miserable. Absolutely miserable. And I've left just piles of destruction, mounds of destruction in their lives. Shattered lives, deeply traumatized lives, because they have never cultivated the will to bear discomfort. With that, we'll have to close for tonight. I hope you tune in again next week for another edition of Character Matters. I'm Dr. George Simon. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Take care.
You are listening to UCY.TV. Why don't you stick around for more awesome radio?